Hi, and welcome to the Revive, Thrive, and Optimize podcast. As always, I have my great co-host, Janet, and behind the scenes is our producer, Mike. So thank y'all for being here.
Hey, good evening, Billy and Mike. I put my smart-looking glasses on today because I wanted to look a little bit more credible.
Like your husband, Don,
Like
right?
my husband, Don. But Billy's the expert, and I've come with some more questions today.
Okay, let's do it,
And
Janet.
I got them right here. So one question that my students were asking is, what is the difference between insulin and glucose? And as we know, insulin impacts every part of the body. And talk a little bit about metabolic dysfunction, insulin, glucose. What blood labs do we need, and what's the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question, Janet. And when I teach my classes, on my summit weekends, I always ask how many people know they're fasting insulin. And there'll typically be a few people who will raise their hand, but what they're thinking of is they're fasting glucose or they're fasting blood sugar. And they're two completely different things, but they work together. So it's a really good question. So glucose or sugar is the amount of sugar or glucose, as they call it, in the bloodstream at any given time. What controls and what moves that sugar from the bloodstream into inside the cells is the hormone insulin. So they're two completely different measurements. They're two completely different things. Glucose is things that we take in or our liver makes through gluconeogenesis. And insulin is the hormone that is a peptide hormone that is produced by our pancreas when we take in sugars, okay, or things that cause a sugar response like breads, pasta, rice, potatoes. It doesn't have to be fruit. It doesn't have to be just sugar like we think of taking white sugar out of a container. So
and can't you eat a candy bar or an apple and your body can't recognize the difference? I mean, obviously one has more nutrition, but they both have insulin.
Well, they both create an insulin response. That's correct. Your body doesn't say, oh, it's an apple, so I don't need to make insulin. It just, it does see the sugar, the carbohydrates broken down, and it says we have to get the sugar out of the bloodstream because high blood sugar drives, dysfunctions in our body. It causes what they call end organ damage or permanent end organ damage. In other words, it's damaging our kidneys when it's high. It's damaging our eyes. It's damaging our heart, damaging our lungs. It's damaging our nervous system. It's damaging our brain. So high blood sugar or glucose or fasting glucose is just a measurement of how much sugar is in the blood at that given time when the blood's taken. Whereas insulin
Wait.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Which blood marker, which blood lab would be for the sugar, for the glucose?
So fasting glucose is the instantaneous, how much was there when I had my blood drawn. A1C or hemoglobin A1C as it's known is a 90 to 120 day average of our blood sugar. And they do that based off the hemoglobin A1C number because the average lifespan of a red blood cell is 90 to 120 days. So through this technology, they're able to take that and say, okay, your average blood sugar, Janet, for this period of 90 days was 5.6, whatever that number is. And so that's a much better marker because it's a longer term marker than just what was our fasting glucose in the moment.
Because my glucose can change throughout the day, even with stress.
It can
and
change.
Cortisol.
Well, it's going to go up in the mornings just because we're waking up. So cortisol is supposed to go up.
Yeah.
So and that's typically when people are having their blood drawn. So that's not wrong, but an A1C is a much better measurement because it gives us a 90 to 120 day average. And we can see trends and patterns that way versus a snapshot.
And what would your A1C be optimally?
Below 5.0.
Okay.
But that's very difficult to do. You have to really be on the Opti plan to get below 5.0. But so talk about that real quick. The standard medical, everybody recognizes that an A1C of 5.7 to 6.4 is considered pre-diabetes, okay? And a 6.5 or above 6.4 is considered full-blown now diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes.
It doesn't matter.
Either?
Type 1 or type 2.
Okay.
Just the only difference in type 1 and type 2. Type 1 does not have a pancreas making insulin. Type 2 has a pancreas making insulin. But over 90 to 95% of diabetics in America are type 2. Their pancreas makes insulin. And we can talk about it, but it makes too much insulin, which is the measurement that nobody's doing that everybody should be doing. Because you've heard me say this many times. I think the most important blood marker that any of us can ever have done is our fasting
insulin.
Because let's say that my A1C is a really, really good 4.8.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say below 5.0, let me preface that. When you look at the studies for men or women with an A1C below 5.0, which is an average blood sugar in the low 90s, okay, when you get down to like 4.8, I'm not looking at a chart, but 4.8, 4.9, your average blood sugar 93 or below, somewhere close to that. So your blood sugars are under really, really good control. You're not eating things that push it up very high for very long, for sure. So when you look at the studies, though, an A1C for a man or a woman of any age of below 5, the risk of death from all diseases plummets.
Wow.
Okay, so the risk of death from heart disease plummets. The risk of death from cancer plummets. The risk of death from stroke plummets. The risk of, so you go through all these things because that insulin and that sugar being high is what causes all the damage. I shouldn't say all the damage. It causes a significant amount of the damage in the diseases we see today. So if my A1C is a really healthy 4.8, I'll get back to that part.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know how much insulin it took me to get to 4.8.
Okay, here we go.
Really doesn't mean a lot to me. So people go, well, my A1C is good. It's 5.5. It's 5.4. How much insulin did it take you to get a 5.5 or 5.4? Because the body is very intelligent. And the body knows that high blood sugar causes permanent end organ damage. Okay?
So the body's going to try to get rid of that.
So the body will make more insulin. It will have the pancreas pump out more insulin to shove that sugar out of the bloodstream into the cells to protect our organs. But what happens to the cells when you have a bunch of insulin being shoved into them, sugar shoved into them from the high insulin?
They have to use a lot more energy.
Well, they have to use a lot more energy. They make 19 times less energy, right, in every cell of the body. So that now they're tired.
Right.
It makes the fat in the cells get bigger. You don't gain new fat cells. You actually make the fat cells we already have bigger. So they start to put on weight, typically around the waist. Even more importantly, you've talked about it before on here. You and I have visceral fat. Mm-hmm. They're fat around their organs, especially their liver, and their pancreas starts to go up, and they get non-alcoholic fatty liver. They get the non-alcoholic fatty pancreases. So when we don't know our insulin number, I always tell them, I don't care what your A1C is. How much insulin did it take? Because the studies show that we miss the diagnosis of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, in most people by 10 to 15 years. In other words, if you're diagnosed today with type 2 diabetes, if you look at the studies that used insulin as a marker, mm-hmm. along with glucose and A1C, you've been diabetic for 10 to 15 years already because the body, again, with its intelligence, says, let's push the sugar out of the cells. Let's push the sugar out of the bloodstream into the cells with more insulin. And so that process has been going on for a decade or more, and then it can't keep up anymore. And the A1C then climbs to above 6.4, and they say, well, you're diabetic, or above 5.7, and they say you're pre-diabetic. So it's a tragedy that we don't measure insulin.
Yes, my next question was going to be, why will the doctors not check
Easy answer.
insulin? And why do so many doctors not even know what fasting insulin is? It's crazy to me.
Well, number one, they're not taught, okay? And it should be medical school 101, first class given, if you ask me. But they don't measure it, Janet, because I can't name, and Beth can't name, who's also a pharmacist, and you can't name a drug or a drug class that lowers your insulin.
So when we're at our doctor,
nobody teaches them, because what drug am I going to write for them for that?
So when I go to my doctor and I want a complete blood panel, and they can't do fasting insulin.
Oh, they can. They won't.
And they won't do fasting insulin. Actually, I've heard from numerous students of mine lately that they're asking for fasting insulin and they don't even know how to find and order it.
Right.
So how can we, being the CEO of our own health, go and get fasting insulin?
Well, you
How
know
much does
that
cost?
I have my own blood panel, and it includes fasting
Yes.
insulin and a lot of other things that
Yes.
we need that they typically don't do. But you can, I can order it for people at a discount. And how much does that cost? It's $40 or so. I mean, it's pretty inexpensive. It may be less than that, but it's certainly not more than $40. They can go online and find labs that they can do it themselves. Probably going to cost a little more because I do so many, I get a discount. But as the CEO of your own health, the number one number they should know is their fasting
insulin.
Yeah.
So
knowing your
fasting
A1C
insulin.
without your fasting insulin
Yes.
is like putting oil in your car but not putting gas in it.
Okay.
Who cares?
Yeah.
You're not going anywhere. And so I see all these people that are told, you're not diabetic, but they have a big belly. They have high blood pressure. They have arthritis that hurts all the time. They have gout all the time. They have fibromyalgia. They can't remember things very well. I can tell you right now that if you look at the research, if you would check their fasting insulin, it's high. Okay? I mean, Wake Forest University has a study that shows that 76% of the people with high blood pressure have high insulin. Now, why is that? Well, when insulin is high, I should say this, insulin is a hormone that without it, we die.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So it's a critical hormone that we need. Type 1 diabetics, before the invention of exogenous injected insulin, died because they couldn't get the blood sugar out of their bloodstream, and they couldn't get it into the cells for energy. So insulin, I want people to understand, is critical for life. And this is a very important point. When insulin is at optimal levels, it's very anti-inflammatory. Insulin comes in, I eat, insulin comes in, or you eat. I eat something really healthy like a steak and a broccoli meal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need a lot of insulin because I'm not running my blood sugar up much. It's going to get a little bleak, right, on the scale. So I make a little bit of insulin. It pushes the stuff into the cell that need to go, and everything works great. I'm not inflamed. I don't have high blood pressure. I'm not retaining fluid from that. But when insulin is chronically high, which nobody's measuring, it creates inflammation. It creates acids like uric acid that leads to gout,
problems.
The kidney issues. It creates lactic acid. It creates pyruvic acid. So it's not a clean burning process when insulin is high anymore to make energy. Now it's dirty. It's polluted. High insulin then creates inflammation that we talked about. And according to Wake Forest, 76% of people with high blood pressure have high insulin, which is creating their high blood pressure because it creates inflammation in the arteries and it creates the body to retain fluid.
So it's the
now they're
sugar
trying to
making you have high blood pressure,
Absolutely.
not the salt.
It's not the salt. No, what happens, Janet, that's a great point, is that when you have high insulin, you spit more you spit more magnesium out in the urine. And what happens when you spit more magnesium and potassium, to be exact, when you spit more magnesium and potassium out in the urine, it makes an imbalance of sodium in the system, and they'll say, well, salt's your problem. Salt's making you swell, when it's actually not. It's insulin that's making them swell. And giving them magnesium and potassium to balance that will correct this issue. But what will really correct it long term is, guess what? Lowering their insulin. But again, Janet, their doctor never told them that, never checked it, because there's no test to measure their insulin. I mean, there's no drug, to lower their insulin, so they won't measure their insulin.
So what is the optimal range for fasting insulin?
Yeah, 2 to 6. We would love it to be 4 or below. Again, very hard to do, but we see it all the time. We see people with, Beth and I don't mind sharing our lab results. Our A1C is usually 4.8 or 4.9, both of us, with a fasting insulin of 2.2, 2.4 is probably the highest I've ever seen either one of us have.
Mine's 3.2.
Yeah, I mean, which is great. Yeah. Again, between 2 and 4 is perfect. When we get above 6, we get into real problems. But here's the real tragedy of it. The standard lab, I know LabCorp for sure, shows up to 26.7 as, quote, normal. It might be normal, but it sure as heck ain't healthy.
Right.
So we don't want to be, certainly don't want to be double digits, because then we're going to have the inflammation, we're going to have the pain, we're going to have the fat gain. Insulin is the hormone for all these people that want to burn fat or lose weight, which I hate the term losing weight, but burn fat, lose fat. Burn fat, not muscle, right? It's on the wall in the pharmacy.
Burn fat, not muscle. You need to lower your insulin.
You have to lower your insulin. Insulin is the hormone that says hold on to more fat because it's shoving fat into the cells. So, it's shoving sugar, I should say, it's shoving sugar into the cells, which makes those cells fat. Okay? When you lower the insulin, the body says, hey, I can get rid of fat. So I don't want to say that insulin is bad, because it's critical.
It's critical for life, especially for type 1 diabetics.
Absolutely. But what is the problem is chronically high insulin levels.
So when, say, type 1 diabetics are just kind of eating a bad diet, do they have to take more and more insulin to keep their blood sugar level?
Which does more and more damage.
More and more damage, and then maybe they aren't realizing it, because insulin is something that saves their life, but they don't realize how bad it is if they get too much.
Well, Janet, they're taught to do whatever they want and cover it with insulin. Oh, you want cake? Eat cake.
And then
just inject more insulin.
Right.
You want to have sweet tea? Have sweet tea. You want to have a Coke? Have a Coke. Just take more insulin. That's what they're taught. It's not necessarily their fault. I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people in the medical community understand the tragedy of high insulin. And so they don't think about it in the type 1 or the type 2. As a matter of fact.
Well, I wanted to talk about that for a second, because I was listening to someone today who refers to osteopenia and osteoporosis as diabetes of the bones. They referred to osteoarthritis as diabetes of the joints. They referred to Alzheimer's as diabetes of the brain, and to glaucoma as diabetes of the eyes. And how do you feel about that? Is the insulin signaling and creating those diseases, that metabolic dysfunction?
The insulin resistance is leading to all those diseases you named and more. There is research that shows that diabetics are at a 50% greater risk of death from all causes. And there is only one common denominator here: higher insulin levels. And the real tragedy of it is, Janet, that yes, I do believe that insulin is the driving factor. High insulin, I should make sure I'm clear, high insulin is the driving factor between everything you named and a whole lot more: strokes, blood clots, heart attacks, cancers, Alzheimer's. I mean, bone loss. It's a driving factor, certainly, between all those things, not only because of its processes of pushing more fat into the body and making more visceral fat, but it creates inflammation. And if you look at all these diseases, they have inflammation, right? Characteristics.
Right.
And so it creates this environment where the body just is sick. The body can't function. And here's the real tragedy. I'll make the case, and I think I can easily make the case, that we treat type 2 diabetics in America, which is 90 to 95% of all the diabetics in America. And most of them, many of them, are undiagnosed because nobody's checking their insulin, right? We know they're 10 to 15 years too late in getting a diagnosis. We're treating them backwards. We're treating them 100% backwards.
Wow.
We're giving them drugs to increase their insulin production when it's a disease already of too much insulin. And so they teach, okay, I want you to understand what these medical organizations teach. I won't specifically name the one that is specific to diabetes, but you can figure it out if you want. They teach that it is a chronic progressive disease. Now, what do they mean? You're never going to get rid of your type 2 diabetes. It's going to get worse, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they teach that because the way they treat them is backwards, and it is chronic and it is progressive if you treat them with more of the poison. And when I say poison, I don't mean insulin is poison. I mean chronically high insulin is what's driving their disease. And so now we give them drugs that say, hey, pancreas, make more insulin. And as it progresses and gets worse, and it will when you give the body more of the disease or more of the problem, then they say, well, we need to inject insulin. We need to have you inject insulin at bedtime. That's usually how it starts. And then as that chronically gets worse, progressively and chronically gets worse because we've done it backwards, we're making the body more and more resistant to the signaling of insulin. Well, now you need a short-acting insulin that you need to take before your 5 meals a day that we recommend.
Wow.
Your 5 meals and snacks of French fries and popcorn and pancakes and grape jelly.
Sugar, yeah.
Sugar, which is what they teach diabetics. So they're super confused, which is why I've started my online type 2 diabetes program for women. And I think it's called Women's Type 2 Solved. I can't even remember exactly, but it's easy to fix. And I don't mean that to say that diabetics are easy to fix, but it is easy to correct once they understand, which is what the program is all about. And so when you think about the fact that we, number one, can't get the medical community to measure the most important hormone. Number two, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where Beth and I graduated from pharmacy school, says that 88.5% of Americans have metabolic disease. I'm gonna translate that in my terms. Chapel Hill did not say this. They said 88.5% of people had metabolic disease. I'm going to term that insulin resistance for you. Okay. So that means that 9 out of 10 people in America, according to this study, have metabolic disease, i.e. diabetes, insulin resistance. We don't diagnose them as diabetics because nobody's checking their insulin. It takes 10 to 15 years a lot of times for their A1C to get to where now they're, quote, diabetic. We'll tell them they're pre-diabetic for the next 7 years. Don't change anything. Don't do anything. Take these drugs. It chronically and progressively gets worse. Whereas if you do what my friend Johnny did, and Johnny was on the podcast, several weeks ago, Johnny Paceover, he told me today that since he has really, really gotten serious since the podcast, he's lost 21 pounds in about 30 days. And he said, man, I finally just cut all the crap out. Wow. He said his brother and his wife was living with him because they were waiting on their house to be finished. And he said it was just, they were bringing in food and they were trying to be good guests. He said, but I was eating things that I would have never eaten. So he's lost 21 pounds. His ankles are not swelling. He asked me, he said, man, my ankles are swelling all of a sudden. I said, your insulin's high. Mm-hmm. And he said, dude, within 3 days of doing what you said, he said, my ankles were completely down. His blood pressure was high. I said, Johnny, Wake Forest University study, same reason your ankles are swelling, same reason your blood pressure's high. He said that last night his blood pressure, this is just today, he was in the pharmacy, his blood pressure was 105/70 or 65.
Wow.
105/65. And so this diabetes thing is not hard to fix, but you can't continue to, I'll use the example of pour gas on the fire and expect your body to overcome the diabetes. But type 2 diabetes, again, I don't want to offend anybody, but type 2 diabetes does not and should not and doesn't have to exist.
And it's hard for people. I have lots of friends with type 2 diabetes, and they have a lot of inflammation.
Yes.
And when you're tired and you're sick and you're inflamed, it's very difficult to work out and be motivated to do anything or to eat right. And I think, especially for women, we're hangry all the time.
Well, Janet,
we have this craving, and all that just takes
You want to know what happens? So when you talk about they're tired and they don't feel like working out, they literally are making 19 times less energy in every cell of their body when they eat. And the reason is because of the insulin resistance. Their body is not able to go through I like to term it this way, the front door.
Right.
They're not able
I
to
love
go
this.
through the front
Hey,
door.
everybody listen to this analogy. This is a good one.
Yeah, this is the easiest way to explain it. They don't come to your house and go through the front door to make energy or to get in to eat the meal. They go through the back door at night when it's locked with the SWAT team coming in.
They bust the door
They
down.
bust the door down. So when a type 2 diabetic or a insulin resistant person, 88.5% of Americans, according to the UNC Chapel Hill study, they literally are the SWAT team busting the back door down in the middle of the night trying to make energy. And so they literally are making 19 times less energy per millions, if not trillions of cells in their body.
Wow.
All day, every day. So think about it. If I'm making my 38 units of energy, of ATP,
by going through the front door,
by going through my front door with my insulin, small amount of insulin, opening the front door, puts the nutrients in the cells, and I'm making 38 units of energy, ATP, and trillions of cells in my body. Okay?
Okay.
That's how you feel 18.
Yeah.
The way you feel like I can't work out, I can't do anything, I can't get off the couch, I hurt, I have fibromyalgia, I have chronic fatigue, I have arthritis, I have all these things. That's when you're making 2 units of energy. The SWAT team's knocking the back door down in the middle of the night. So
and
now you're making 2 versus 38, which is 19 times less by the math I do. And when you think about that, coming in my front door, making the 38, is a very clean burning process. I'm not polluting my system with a bunch of uric, pyruvic, and lactic acid. But when our SWAT team's coming in, it's not coming in trying to be quiet or kind or nice. They're coming in and they're blowing things up, right, to get in. And there's smoke and there's all this debris going everywhere. That's what we have going on. So now they're making this massive amount of lactic, pyruvic, uric acids. They're making 19 times less energy. Now their joints are swollen. Their ankles are swelling. They're holding on to fluid and they're told not to eat salt. It's a disaster. And then they're given drugs that make it all worse because it's a chronic progressive disease, they're told, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And then the side effects from those drugs just continue to multiply.
Well, that depletes, guess what? More magnesium. More potassium. It's a disaster. It's
vicious cycle.
I always explain it, and I know you've heard me say this, and you're probably tired of hearing me say this. It's like a big snowball going down a big hill, and the snowball's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And until the person decides to come do something like the OptiU program or something like that, they have to decide to do that, and they have to get on the other side of that snowball, and they have to start pushing up that hill. And then once they get up to the top of that hill, it's all downhill the other way where the snowball gets smaller and things get better. But until they do that, Janet, they're never going to have any success because they're being taught to eat the wrong things. They're being taught to take things that make the problem worse. We're literally drowning these people in insulin. I mean, we are literally drowning them in the problem. And again, insulin in the right form, in the right amounts, is not a problem. It is a lifesaver. I'm glad that my body makes insulin. But if I had chronically high insulin, I'd have a pot belly.
Yeah.
I would have fatty liver potentially.
Lots of visceral fat.
I would have visceral fat around my heart. I would be inflamed. There's no way I could feel 18 at 57 years old. There's no way Don could, at 60, whatever, feel the way he does. There's no way that you can at 60, 61, whatever. There's no way. And so when I see these people and I look around, I can tell you if you're insulin resistant without
just
a test.
by looking at your
I
waist,
can look at you.
The waist circumference.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can look at people and tell if they're insulin resistant, but I can't get them to check.
I can't get
their doctor to do it. So that's why I created my own blood panel.
All right. So let's say that we take your blood panel.
Yep.
We know our fasting insulin and it's too high. So what's the quickest way to get it down and get everything under control and lose some of this inflammation and get some energy back? What do you recommend?
Okay, Janet, I'm going to go back to the 5 pillars. I mean, it is that simple, seriously. God-given quality foods, that is food that will not run the insulin up. Plenty of good quality protein, plenty of good quality fat, quality low glycemic carbohydrates. Okay? The foundational 4, the world's best nutritional supplements, is pillar 2. Without the multi and the magnesium, they're never going to fix it. One vitamin or mineral deficiency can make them insulin resistant. Do you know how many Americans are vitamin and mineral deficient in multiple things, not just one? Magnesium's the number 1 deficiency in America, and guess what is the most critical step to making that insulin work efficiently.
Magnesium.
And most
how
people say,
many
well,
people-
I'm taking magnesium. I'm taking magnesium citrate, which is a laxative. I'm taking magnesium oxide, which is a rock.
It's like
for a
taking
laxative.
M&Ms.
You might as well, it's worthless to your cells.
So it's the form of magnesium, the correct forms.
Yes, the organic chelated forms. So those two steps, eating the right foods that don't run your blood sugar through the roof, not pouring gas on the fire, taking the right quality, professionally formulated supplements. Pillar 3 is drink water from a medical device. So I'm going to simplify that, though, if everybody doesn't have a Kangen machine. Drink water. I don't know, my clip from the weekend, right? Opie, Andy Griffith's show. What does Sheldon tell Opie?
Drink water.
That's what I say that all the time to people. Drink water. Not diet drinks, not poisonous diet drinks. Don't drink those things.
Low
Drink
fat and
water.
diet drinks.
Right.
Stop
Don't
that
do it.
stuff.
Correct. Pillar 4, science-based exercise. I want to simplify that. Walk. Just go out for a walk every day. A 10-minute walk, 10 to 15-minute leisurely walk after a meal reduces the insulin response by up to 50%.
That's amazing.
So let's say your fasting insulin is 12 or 20. Let's use 20.
Okay.
Your fasting insulin's a really normal 20. You got high blood pressure and you're 100 pounds overweight and you feel like crap. If you'll go out for a 10 to 15-minute walk after a meal, it says that you could, just by that one thing, you could change that number to a 10.
Wow, that's cutting it in half.
Think about that. You could cut it.
Wait, did you guys hear that?
A 10 to 15-minute leisurely walk.
Will reduce your insulin by 50% after a meal.
Up to
50%.
50%. So that's pillar 4, is science-based exercise or walking or movement. Pillar 5 is good sleep. If you don't sleep a quality 6+ hours a night, 6 hours is the cutoff in the studies, you don't efficiently produce IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which is your overnight part of your overnight control of your blood sugar the next morning. So I have people that say, my blood sugar's good during the day, but in the morning it's
really
terrible.
high. Yeah.
I go, you don't sleep good.
Yeah.
Oh, I sleep fine. You don't sleep good. You don't have a good quality of sleep. And guess what we use to fix that for most people?
Drugs.
Magnesium.
Oh.
They use drugs.
They use drugs.
Magnesium.
We use magnesium. Yeah.
Magnesium for most people will change their sleep quality the first night. Seriously.
But it's got to be the right magnesium.
Yes,
so I don't think people realize how much money they're wasting on cheap supplements. So get the good magnesium.
Well, they're not only wasting money, Janet. If you look at studies, they're probably causing harm.
More harm.
They're putting in toxins.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, this is a topic, honestly, that we could talk about for the next 55 podcasts and not even come close to covering it all. We've just touched the surface. But one thing that I think is really important to remember, or a couple things that I think are really important to remember here. Number 1, type 2 diabetes is completely resolvable. Completely resolvable. We do it all the time for people. We get them off all their insulin, all their drugs. Number 2, you cannot believe that it's a chronic progressive disease, because if you do, there is no fixing it. You cannot listen to the experts,
right?
The so-called experts that are teaching you to eat French fries and pancakes and inject more insulin. Won't work. Okay. And number 3, you should know your fasting insulin number. Okay, you should absolutely know your fasting insulin number.
So the name of this podcast should be, do you know your fasting insulin number? Do you know your fasting
insulin? And not your fasting sugar. Do you know your fasting insulin number? And if you don't, Janet, I mean, just as blunt as I can be, you're not a good CEO.
And it's hard, and I know it's hard. And I have a student who went to his doctor 2 weeks ago and begged for them to tell him.
Yeah, he told me all about it.
Yeah, and they couldn't even tell him the difference. They didn't know the difference. They said your A1C is your fasting insulin,
and that is about as opposite as Batman and Batgirl. Okay. I mean, I don't know how to say it. It's just, it makes no sense. And you would think that somebody in the medical profession would certainly understand the difference.
Well, I know for me to get mine down quickly when we started this program is I did stop eating fruit. And I know fruit and fiber and there's lots of nutrition, but I wanted to focus on sugar. And I remembered you saying your body looks at a Snickers bar and an apple pretty much the same way. And so I cut out all sugar except for berries, and my fasting insulin has stayed very low.
Look, I tell people, I'm not telling people not to eat fruit. I'm telling them I don't typically. And the reason for that is if you do look at the studies, an average size, medium, average apple has 35 grams of sugar. Look at how much sugar's in a Snickers bar or a Hershey bar.
Yeah.
Now, it's not equivalent. I understand that. But the insulin response has to happen.
It's the same.
It's 35 grams of sugar. The pancreas doesn't go, oh, well, it was 35 grams from an apple. I just won't produce any insulin. It's 35 grams. Now, like you said earlier, though, there's a lot of nutrients and nutrition in an apple that aren't in a Hershey bar, obviously. But the insulin response, if we're trying to overcome type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance, it's 35 grams sugar any way you slice it, okay? So we got to think. But you're right. Berries, blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, raspberries, those will be the lowest sugar fruit. But I like to strategically use fruit after a hard workout with my Opti-U Whey Shake. That is a great place to put some sugar or glycogen, we call it, back in the system. And my go-to is typically blueberries.
We did that last night. We had your vanilla protein powder blended up with some blueberries, and it was amazing.
Yeah, and that's the way a lot of people like to do it. I just eat the blueberries separate.
Well, it was like a milkshake.
It can really be like a dessert. Yeah. So awesome. Look, this is a topic we need to come back to for sure. We need to get more on this, more on hormones. I mean, insulin is a hormone. But we can get deep into the weeds on this and why it's creating the heart disease and the cancers and the strokes and the blood clots and the Alzheimer's and the osteopenia and osteoporosis and the glaucoma you talked about or the eye disease. I mean, there's so many things that this insulin tragedy in America is driving, and it's being completely ignored except by people like us and a few others that are talking about it. But the medical community, I'm afraid, until they can find a drug to lower it, is just going to continue to ignore it. And it's really sad. I have a nurse practitioner who sends me some insulin numbers now that she's learned. She came through my weekend, and she's checking people's fasting insulin, and she's seeing them in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And remember, we want it 2 to 6. Okay? 2 to 6. 2 to 4 is even more ideal, but 2 to 6. She's seeing it 10, 12, 15 times higher than that. So yeah, and really scary.
There's people we want to help out there, and they're so discouraged, and they don't know who to trust.
Well, if they have high blood pressure, if they have swelling, if they have pains and aches, if they have low energy, they really need to take a look and think about their fasting insulin.
And can you take your height and divide it by 1/2, and your waist circumference should be less than 1/2 of your height? Do you
Janet,
follow that at all?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
So I don't want to say yes or no because I don't know the answer. I do know this, and I'll look up the statistic. I don't want to try to quote it tonight because we don't typically discuss what we're going to talk about. We just
come in and talk.
So yeah, this is just me and you having a conversation. There is some research that I can find that a woman with a waist above a certain size and a man with a waist above a certain size have a much greater increased risk of death from all causes. But I don't want to quote those numbers because I need to look it up before I do.
Okay.
All right.
Thank
you so much for being here again.
I learned more.
Y'all, Janet does this a completely volunteer basis. Mike does this on a completely volunteer basis. And I couldn't do it without y'all. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. See you next time.